Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, a neighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. Welcome back to another episode of Things Hidden, our podcast where we do a deep dive into current events with an emphasis on anthropological framework to give us an understanding of things hidden since the foundation of the world. And on this episode, we'll be joined by editor at A Neighbor's Choice and writer Surit Dasgupta. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Today we're going to talk about zealots. Zealots is the word of the day, and zealous behavior. We see in the headlines, people again are zealous for their sides, whether it's in the war of the Ukraine war with Russia versus Ukraine, or it's in this matter of China versus Taiwan, or in the matter of Israel versus Palestine. Notice that in each of these conflicts, we have what is tantamount to war between brothers. So the first thing I want us to think about is that each of these conflicts, Taiwan versus China, brothers, members of the same family in some sense, in a lot of sense, genetically, literally, culturally, brothers, although they have distinctions and they like to emphasize their differences. Taiwan and China are brothers, and they have conflict about who is China. Who is China and what is China to be? What does China encompass? What does China's values stand for? What do they stand for? And America is involved in that conflict as the world empire that's been used by all kinds of special interests like a zombie. I've said before on America reminds me that the government, the foreign policy, the apparatus of the State Department, and all that is entailed by that reminds me of those zombie ants that they get like hollowed out by some kind of fungus spore, and then you'll see them in nature, these horrific photos of these little ants walking around, moved by some kind of spore that's kind of like taken over the host. And it's unfortunate, but that's become America is currently, run by a government that doesn't have any regard for its own people whatsoever. It's the last thing on its mind, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. You saw with the new Speaker of the House, who looks like Stephen Colbert. He makes a big position. I'm big on a big radical stance on marriage and abortion, federal abortion ban, as if to signal to the Republican base, oh look, he's a radical purist, really. So they say, oh my goodness, if he's willing to take such radical stances on those social issues, my goodness, he'll be one of us on our reservations for war. Wrong. This guy's signaled. There's no way he got so much of the support of all these fake, neocon military industrial complex owned politicians on the Republican Party in the House. He got all their votes and support so fast. And there's no way they would have given their support so fast for someone who would be in any way, shape, or form unreliable for the interest of war. So I'm setting this up. We can dive into some of these discussions, but going back, we've got Taiwan and China, rivalrous brothers. We've got Israel and Palestine, rivalrous brothers. I mean, both of them having, narratives that they are convinced, and ethnic, claims and religious and all kinds of different things that they believe convince them that they are the rightful occupant of the different land parcels in question in that region. Then you have Ukraine and Russia, where again, you have ethnic brothers, cousins, where you have lots of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. You have rivalry that goes back many years, different times, people are on different sides. But in general, this is rivalry between family. And in each of these three hotspots that we are being media narratives focused on, America, has taken, America's government and its Western allies have taken a position in favor of one of the rivals over the other. And that's the position that we're supposed to kind of accept. Although with the Israel-Palestine one, that one's a little bit more complicated, right? Because in that one, there are a lot of politically correct, in vogue leftist institutions and figures that are able to signal some support for Palestine and get away with it, even though our government's interests are more solidly in support of Israel on the matter. Unlike with Ukraine and Russia, you don't have a contingent of people like Ilhan Omar and AOC and so forth, and powerful magazines and institutions who can speak a little bit about criticizing Ukraine's policies towards ethnic Russians. There's none of that in that conflict and that one. But in the Israel-Palestine one, there's a little bit more carve out because of the left's long, connection with that Palestinian cause as a kind of proxy for their grievances against what they call white supremacy here in America and colonialism. It comes back to neo-colonialism and the whole leftist movement, the new left that developed out of that period in 60s and 70s. All of that gives a little bit more of a complicated narrative with the Israel-Palestine conflict because the left is hegemonic and the part of the left that is pro-Israel tends to be the one most represented in power politically and media narrative-wise. But there is another part of the left which is got some power and has some, cultural sway. That's a little bit more pushback. So that one's a little bit more complicated. But at the end of the day, the media and the government of America are very keen on whipping up zealotry and a zealous spirit about these conflicts.
Yeah, I mean, you've basically covered it all, and you've been pretty accurate in describing the sibling rivalry part of the conflict, right? This is like it's been like in Genesis, when we hear about, and I know this has been often used a lot, but the rivalry between Cain and Abel is pretty much a setting point of all of these things that we are seeing around the world. You can add India, Pakistan to that, to the list of brother conflicts that you have mentioned.
Right.
And Israel, Palestine, and all of these conflicts that we're seeing, and is no escaping that these many of these conflicts are between parties who share a very similar culture, very similar demographic, similar language, and all of that, religion in some cases, like the Ukrainian and the Russian have a very similar belief in the Orthodox faith. So it's all basically a consequence of the first ever conflict in human history, which is the Cain and Abel story.
right?
Yeah,
Right.
it's mhm.
Rene Girard says all desire is a desire for being ultimately. And I think that's appropriate when we anchor why does the Cain and Abel story, primordial, story that it is, why does it symbolize the same conflict that we see today? And ultimately, Cain coveted his brother's position in terms of being considered right with God, being pleasing to God, right? And again, if we want to take it to just the science of anthropology for a moment, beyond, which again, you can't divorce these things in any clear cut way, but it helps if you want to look at things on like a kind of a, scientific type basis where you're not employing claims of metaphysics. God is a stand-in for the word the ultimate good, the communal ultimate good, the best position in the community, uh, the highest good. And in that sense, Cain, the brother of Abel, is jealous of Abel's position of being considered in right standing with the ultimate good of that community, of that primordial community, which is a representation of the whole world and all the different conflicts that have happened since. And of course, Cain kills Abel, and on that murder, he founds the first city, the Bible says. So the first political act is an act of human sacrifice, right? But unlike all kinds of other stories, like Romulus and Remus and this founding of Rome, the camera does not stand with the conqueror, the one who has inflicted an act of wrath or vengeance, but camera stays with the person who has been assaulted, who has been murdered in this case. So the narrative says God's basically saying, hey, what have you done, right? What have his blood is crying out here. This is not something that we can paper over with mythology. So this is like a record scratch in the history of mythology that's wonky. It's different. It's not exactly how all mythologies have gone, in which the primordial act of a murder is that of the gods, not humans, first of all, and that of a kind of obvious act of righteous justification, right? There's no camera in the Babylonian myth with Marduk or these other gods and Egyptian gods. The camera doesn't stay with the one who gets killed and says, hey, wait a second, this isn't right what you've done. This isn't going to help anything. His blood cries out. That you don't find that in ancient Norse mythology. You don't find that in mythology anywhere around the world except in this story preserved for us in Genesis. And I think it's important to recognize and to reemphasize how radical that is and how radical of a break that is from the surrounding world of mythology that this story comes in.
It all leads up, like the Old Testament revelation all leads up uh to something, and I hope we can explore this, leads up to the crucifixion story, which is the ultimate redemption story, right? It's uh it's the story of all stories, basically. And this what we are seeing in the Middle East is like the clash of two parties, like, who have an incomplete revelation. They don't have quite the gospel redemptive arc, the completeness of the gospel that Christianity has. And therefore, you can see how even an incomplete story, grasping of the story of the Bible, can lead to a real cycle of violence. And and I think Jesus is the key here, in that he wraps all of the stories in the Old Testament, the Cain and Abel story, the story between Joshua and his brothers, David and Saul, and it goes on. It Like, there's this even in the Old Testament there are these fits and starts of, even though we are seeing reconciling, we are seeing forgiveness, glimpses of these things that we can see fully in Christ, uh, we still have an incompleteness to the Old Testament, which I think is needs highlighting here.
Yeah, because
And
you don't have it's pointing, it's going somewhere, but then there's not a
right,
completion. You don't
right,
have you don't have the transition from, as we mentioned in the past, a collective temple that is built by man and constructed with, kind of a collective ethnos in mind, a kind of collectivism. Um, you don't have that transition to the ultimate penetrative level of society, which is the human person, right? So it's almost like inevitable that in God's
right.
redemptive plan, His
Mhm.
package had to go beyond just an ethnos and center into a perfect human person that people could emulate, no matter where they were around the world. That would be easier for the whole world to look at a human person as their figure hero rather than an ethnos with its own set of religion and internal sectarian disputes and ways of worship and language and all that. Ultimately, that was going to have to transition to a universal call to emulate a human person. And then, of course, there is a collective aspect to that,
Well,
right? When you're
mhm.
brought into a church community, there you don't discard at all the community part, but it takes a backseat in terms of the framework of forgiveness towards the human person, right? Because ultimately, if you can't get your personal relationships right with forgiveness, you can't even begin to get a community structure right, and then you can't get foreign affairs right.
Well, I mean, yeah, you are right. You are absolutely accurate. And what I was getting at, I guess, is that this incompleteness, this refusal to comprehend the ultimate final universal arc of the redemptive story is what ultimately, leads to zealotry, right? Is that okay, you have accepted all of these stories, but you are accepting it just within the framework of your locality or your state or whatever, but you are not going to
Nation
accept,
or your denomination, right? Everybody can
yeah,
go
or
to
your
heaven.
denomination.
Well,
Yeah,
everybody
right.
everybody can go to heaven in our team, but nobody outside. We don't know what goes on there. That's a bunch of heathens. you know.
Yes, yes. And I guess this is why the gospel was so scandalous even in Jesus's time.
Right.
We oftentimes, you know, fail to grasp the controversial nature of the gospel, and by controversial I mean like it's a very scandalous to the to the people who were living in Jesus's time. And these people, they had a worldview that put their own group, own tribe at the center of the world. I mean, this was the same whether you look at it from the view of the Romans or the Jews at that time, or the, any parties involved. And
Aztecs.
yeah, Aztecs or like the Egyptians, or all of them thought that they had and I'm kind of like tongue in cheek here, they had a kind of their own manifest destiny, I guess. So like these groups, and what Jesus came and did is that he put humanity at the center of everything, right? So he universalized what the Jews taught and practiced. He brought to the whole. That's why you have the veil at the temple being torn in two when he was crucified, right? When he died on the cross, the veil was torn, which signified that the world, the entire world, had the access to the Holy of Holies, right? So the, this is why, and I guess this is why Christian worldview tends to be more universalist, right? That there's you can't put a culture on Christianity because there's so many cultures across the globe that shares the Christian faith. You have the African, the Ethiopians, and you have the Europeans, and you had the Middle Eastern people, and even scattered throughout Southeast Asia and so on and so forth. But it's very hardly that you will find that same level of universality in even uh, tolerant religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, right? There's You can always put an ethnicity on those religions. So yeah, and this is related to the incompleteness of the redemption arc, how we grasp it, and
Yeah.
so on.
And it's when a lot of the mistakes that have been made by people who have had a zeal for Christianity to the point of contesting things with conquests and inquisitions have been when they have failed to put the primacy of Christ's orientation of the temple in the human person seriously. Because if one is to take that framework seriously, you can't be having a flippant kind of approach to killing people in the name of spreading that message, because those are human persons. Now, in their theologies, they truly believed, oh, we'll kill them, and they will, if we kill this heretic or this barbarian or whatever, that it will, bring prestige to the name of Jesus, and that will civilize the people in that area, and it will, you know, it will prevent less people from falling into errors that could damn their souls, and we don't want to damn them, and so on and so forth. And they came up with all kinds of justifications to believe truly that they were right in their zeal. But all of that zealous spirit was at some point obfuscating the primacy of the human person as sacred. That one is, when God says God desires mercy, not sacrifice, it's not just a kind of token aspiration that kind of hangs lightly above the background of our life, but it is rather the animus of everything, right? As this idea of a mercy driven culture has to look for other means of like promoting the good and the just and the beautiful without resorting to sacrificial impulses of violence. That is the entirety, everything Jesus did. This whole idea. One of the things I don't like about calling Jesus's work nonviolence is because it's become so, it's ghettoized, right? Because of culture, they've ghetto some kind of like other that Gandhi, Martin Luther King do, and even zealous, sacrificially minded Christians will still say, yeah, there's some of that nonviolence in Jesus' work here and there. And we've talked about how they kind of explain that away in different ways. But really, nonviolence is just the same synonym in some sense as love, right? And love is a way in which you treat your neighbor and your person next to you in a way that anchors things with forgiveness rather than zealous vengeance, right? Because even Cain initiates violence from our vantage point, but from his vantage point, he was dishonored, right? He felt ashamed. So he felt like the insult was initiated by Abel. Whatever he was doing had insulted his pride and sense of position and relationship to the community, whatever it was in that story. And so therefore, he was insulted. So he felt like he was responding to the insult and dishonor with a reciprocal act of force in the form of murder. And of course, the story, even in that state in Genesis, says, nah, that's not how this is going to be working. This can't be lasting. And of course, there's some, protection put on Cain as a mark so as to not keep this vengeance cycle spiraling out of control, so that the human species can survive in some sense, right? But I think it's important.
Right.
I just want to speak to spirit of Christendom and Christian nationalism or whatever, these different things that pop up when you want to use force. If you can't get your relationships right in your family, in your neighborhood, in terms of a nonviolent response to your neighbor if they're mean or disrespectful or a drug addicted or whatever, if you can't even figure out how to practice that spirit of forgiveness, that doesn't mean lenience, everything goes. No, we're not talking about that. You can have standards within a nonviolent framework of how to deal with these things. And there can be ways of having punishment and, consequences without having a violent, zealous spirit animating it. But if one can't work those things out on a human person level, on a neighbor to neighbor, brother to brother level, then how are you going to go out to the world and baptize the nations? If you haven't figured that out as a human person level in your own micro scale relationships in your own town or village, there's no way you can go out and then take that, kind of weak, like you would say, incomplete picture of redemption and then go spread it to the world. It's going to look like what we have seen in the past, some of the mistakes of the churches have made, right? In terms of using violent zeal to spread the gospel.
Yeah, the zealotry that you see within Christendom is a kind of refusal to acknowledge the brotherhood of humanity. Is kind of like fortifying yourself rather than going out and baptizing the nations, right? So, in order to baptize the nations, you'll have to recognize a degree of kinship with the nations outside of your own.
And you have to, and it can't be an abstract sense, right? Because that's unfortunately how so much of, like the British Empire and other things are easy to criticize in hindsight, but you look back at that and this kind of patronizing love, right? Sometimes that patronizing love, of course, is not a true reflection of dignified human personhood love, as Christ demonstrated with his life. Uh, that that that's something that you kind of miss when you think of, oh, we can, civilize the world or something. That's not the picture here.
Right, right. Yeah. Like it has to be done from a place of self-sacrifice, right? Like I'll give you an example. The British Empire, when it was colonizing the third world and so on, it was doing so out of a very pragmatic uh, sense. Like it was doing so from a very okay, we are going to go out there and colonize these nations, and they are going to be their resources are going to help us in sustaining our this great big empire that we have built. But some of the missionaries that have come to other places, you can sort of see them this one person by the name of William Carey, who basically like sacrificed his entire life. He left the comfort of his home so he could develop the languages of the place of this place where he was in. He was in India, and he made the language comprehensible, readable, so that vast amounts of literature could be made in those languages. And he erected healing institutions, education institutions. So this was this I think when it comes to Christianity having a positive effect in the world, it tends to be more successful when it is done individually from the perspective of a person or a group of persons, rather than from the perspective of an institution or a state. Rarely will you find uh, Christianity flourishing as a result of state occupation, but you will find Christianity flourishing as a result of personhood, self-sacrifice from a personhood point of view. Like even in the Bible, in the book of Acts, we see this one man called Paul, who is doing all sorts of. He's traveling around, he's He has barely a place to stay, and he has barely any some resources that he has from his tent making profession, and he doesn't have an army behind him. He doesn't have a group of zealots behind him, but he all that he does is he does it from his own personal efforts and his commitment, his conviction that Jesus wants to use him to save the world.
Yeah, and Paul, of course, he says he was a zealous person for the law in his prior life, prior to converting with forgiveness. Um, as I mentioned with Daryl Cooper last week in a podcast I did with him, when Jesus confronts Paul on his way to kill more of Jesus's followers in the name of God, Jesus offers him a forgiveness message without any requirement for him to pay anything. And you need to give me goats, or you need to give me some wealth and build me an empire and get me an army. He doesn't do any of that like we see from other religions. He just offers them forgiveness. Of course, at the end, it does cost Paul his life, but it's not in that kind of vindictive, kind of retributive spirit that he loses his life in that way. He actually gained, to die is to gain, is how Paul goes out, his thinking, and when he goes that way. But he doesn't, that spirit of to die is to gain can be used by zealots, and Paul was familiar with zealots that were very prominent in his time, in anger and outrage against what was happening to their people, and wanted to have a violent overthrow of the Roman occupation. And Jesus was a message that was contending in that same conversation between folks who were more establishment oriented, like the Sadducees, down to the Pharisees, a little bit more populist, down to these zealots that were more radical revolutionaries. The Essenes were doing their own type of radical revolt in their own way. And Jesus's message comes in there and just upsets the whole framework, because he's offering, hey, you're going to have to love your neighbor. And ultimately, once you get that right, you're going to have to love your enemy. And, there's a paradox here, because in, mimetic theory, Rene Girard points out how much, conflict happens because of our similarities. And that similarities and closeness includes our brothers. That's why brothers and, siblings can be the most rivalrous of all, and actually distance, both in, familial ties and geographical location, actually can help create relative harmony in relationship to people. You don't have much problem. I don't have any problems with anybody in Mongolia that I know about. That's far away from me, and I don't have a problem with it. It's not a big thing on my radar. I'm not aggrieved by local politics in India, or in that sense, I'm not swept up by passions about what's going on there. It's distance, right? Distance in different ways. And that's why the big conflict is, can you love your neighbor as yourself, not less than you or more than you, because both of those can end up in violence and error. But can you love them as you love yourself, in the same way, the same balance that you love yourself, not too much, not too little, but kind of a healthy relationship that you have with your own self. And that's a kind of love, of course. And then can you mirror that same healthy balance, not too little, not too much, towards your neighbor? And if you can, and if you can mimic that and can create a contagion of that culture, that's when you can start to heal things around the world. Because when you don't have that anchoring right of how to love your neighbor down the road right, again, you won't have any framework of flesh and blood relationality to be able to figure out the problems of somebody in Mongolia or North Korea. Now, we live in a much more globalized situation. It's becoming more and more a global village, as Marshall McLuhan would say. So things are becoming closer, but there's still a lot of differences that, haven't been, and they probably won't be removed, so to speak, because, difference in the Christian framework is not inherently evil. It's some differentiation, some forms of differentiation can be evil, but others are not. And so therefore, we're not at war with differentiation. as a victimist is. A victimist is at war with differentiation because it can be the occasion for sacrifice. And we are at war with the spirit of sacrifice that we have in our own heart. And that includes a zealot, violent, aggressive spirit that manifests in all kinds of things. It doesn't have to just be the classic thing we see on the news where people are bombing or doing suicide, terrorism, and horrific stuff. It's also the zealot, aggressive spirit that we bring into our business conduct, where we think I've got to beat my competitor no matter what, or beat that rival at the job office. That zealous, aggressive, I've got to beat them spirit leads to all kinds of conflict and all kinds of brokenness and disappointment and enslavement to passions that are not really truthful.
Right. And another thing that people often don't realize is that a zealot has many things in common with a person who is a proponent of globalism, is one world, city, village, is that both of them, both the zealot or the nationalist and the globalist, treats differentiation as potential violence, right? And the zealot uh, has a worldview from his own perspective, which places his group at the top of the pyramid, and the globalist wants there to be no differences at all, which is absolutely not the point of the Christian message. The Christian message does not erase boundaries. It's a lot of people quote Galatians chapter 3, is that there are no races, there are no nationalities, but that there is not saying that there won't be any differences. That's saying that we will have a peaceful coexistence with those with uh, you know cultures and ethnicities different than us, or genders different than us. We'll have a peaceful coexistence with them. We won't war with one another as it was in the ancient societies. So there is absolutely a place for ethnos, the concept of ethnos in Christianity, and differentiation as a result. And one of the things that really makes the peaceful coexistence of brothers possible is to acknowledge that the brother is not the same as myself. Because if I would say that the brother is completely the same as myself, I would indulge in practices like the ancients did, right? Like covet my brother's own being, and consume him, whether in the form of grotesque
But they didn't. But
thing.
they didn't. And I know what you're saying, but just for clarification, the ancients and used sacrifice and these ritual cannibalism in the earlier stages as means of deterring people from having a sense of sameness with people who were different from them, whether it was a different ranking and hierarchy in your community, or considering yourself the same as somebody from a rival tribe down the river. Uh, the ancient communities were they were very carefully designed, ritualistic driven, ritual driven hierarchies meant to mediate difference and contain it. And it was only when it was, would break out because those sacrificial boundaries of differentiation were broken because of a zealous spirit, whether because of a revenge feud that got too out of control, and was not able to be tamped down by sacrificial uh, restraint, or if society was just at a point of a tipping point in terms of scarcity or whatever. Those are the things that would kind of break out the society's spirit of runaway covetousness for another's being into a state of war of all against all, like you are talking about there with the brothers.
Right. They feared sameness, right? They feared sameness to the extent that they had to get rid of one so that there is only one of a
And let's
kind.
let's be clear though that the ethnos, the differences are not something that are differences that like God does not going to have segregation in the new heavens and new earth. Okay, I don't believe that for a second. So these are differences as we understand them this side of heaven and the new creation. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, that while there may be preferences, I like this type of singing and this type of custom and this type of food, this type of language, this type of relationality to ancestors, and you have those differences. We cannot idolize those things and think we can take those to heaven with us, because we don't really know. I mean, who knows? I'm not saying there's that we're all going to be one giant, undifferentiated being like Hinduism, where you cease to exist, your absence of personality is completely evaporated, and you're subsumed into the kind of unity of all things. I'm not
Yeah.
suggesting that, but so there will be something in terms of distinctions between, but I think it will be more personhood driven. Who you are as a person will make, your memories, your desire, in terms of the completely healed versions of your desires will be with you in the new creation spirit, in the new creation vision that the Bible paints.
Yeah, right. I mean, the Bible is ultimately painting a kingdom, right, where we are going to be peacefully coexisting with one another. We're going to recognize God's image in one another. And you're right. We are going to be primarily focused on personhood, because God's has created each person uniquely. Is one person is not the same as another, regardless of which tribe you belong to. You're going to have very fundamental personal differences within,
In
even
some
within a
sense,
tribe.
yeah, in some sense, the boundaries that you're talking about on the earthly level are part of what the Bible calls the catechon, which is to restrain the lawless undifferentiation, right? So
Well,
catechon,
it's not.
a
It's
tool to help human beings this side of perfection to handle their relationships with one another.
Yeah, that's definitely a part of it. But there's also some uniqueness. Like for example, there's a love of home, right? Which is like the positive view of actually what nationalism is. The love of your home, the love of your neighborhood, the love of family. So how nationalists, and I'm just using nationalism here as a negative connotation, because it tends to have that negativeness, that hostility towards the other tribes. So what nationalism and what zealotry, these kinds of worldviews, what they do is they have this hostility towards differentiation, in the sense that they want to they tend to have hostile perceptions of people from other tribes, and that is this war against boundaries from the right, and the war against boundaries from the left is that no, there shouldn't be any boundaries at all.
You're saying
uh,
the war against from the right isn't against boundaries; it's for boundaries, right? Is that what you?
well, it's like it can be both, right? Like for this, they see boundaries as positive, as like preserving of their own culture, tradition, and so on. But at the same time, that boundary itself for them becomes a marker of their hostility towards the people of the outer group. So you can see that they are really warring against the boundary while claiming to, you know, highlight it, or preserve it. It's like a
I
very
think. Well, I think.
paradoxical thing.
Yeah, yeah. I can see that even in the scapegoat, right? Because if the whole community is united against the scapegoat because of some arbitrary difference that stands out in that scapegoat that they perceive, right? They feel that arbitrary difference, meaning they're in the ancient world, they maybe have been, handicapped or disabled or disfigured or small or whatever, right? Something that stands out. Um, that kind of differentiation that the community feels towards the scapegoat as something monstrously different is, in some sense, a cope for the relative sameness that they have, right? Because in seeing the person, let's say someone's born with one eye, right? A cyclops or something, this figure that we see in mythology. In seeing that person as this monstrous other, it's actually a coping mechanism for the fact that actually, their monstrosity of difference is actually, in some sense, closer to home for who they are in a kind of a being sense, in an ontological sense. They want to kill the Cyclops as a way of making sure that they're not in any way, shape, or form related to or close to the monstrous, different scapegoat, right? And I think that's kind of what you're getting at too, with the, like you're saying, spirit of ethno-narcissism or nationalism, or all these different isms. They want to set themselves up. Like, for example, we must go against China. We must go against China, while we become more and more authoritarian and surveillance oriented, right? And collectivist in America, I'm talking about now, we must go against China, but you become more and more like China. But they're a scapegoat. They're invading our culture with all kinds of control of our media. But yet we've had all kinds of degenerate, decivilizing stuff happening in our media for some time. So it's almost like, they're so different because they're actually closer to us than we want to realize, right?
Or we want to become like them while going against them, right? And in doing so, we're actually erasing the boundary, and in a state of rivalrous sameness.
Why do they get to be so brutal and hierarchical in China? Why can't we be like that too with our rulers?
Right.
They're jealous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sure. And this is the thing that many of these zealot minded groups fail to see, is that the moment you step outside and start poking fingers at like China, or like North Korea, like so you tend to drop down all the boundaries. You tend to be more globalist in that sense. And that is why a lot of these and I'm just speaking from purely societal observation here, not being a conspiracy theorist of any kind. But that is why like a lot of these nationalist movements and these revolutionary movements get easily co-opted by people who want to see the erasure of all boundaries. It's because they play into their hands, and they're just not aware of it. So
because nationalism, well, for one example, eliminates differences between regions and localities in America.
Right.
In my example, and I'm sure the same for India, right? I mean, I don't want to
exactly. India, there was no such thing as an unified Indian nation before the British came, and it was a separated kingdoms. Sure, there was like cultural sameness and all of that, but nationalism was what really brought a country like India together. And I'm sure the same happened to some degree with the United States and many other countries, like Russia or China, which was also like different kingdoms, right? So all of these like these nationalistic movements have proven historically to be like totally erasing boundaries, regional boundaries, fundamentally critical tribal boundaries, like things like nationalism forced people of different languages, different religions to come together under the banner of the nation state, basically.
Yeah. I want to go to the some of the teaching things we can learn anthropologically from the Bible. I was inspired by listening to a few podcasts by Fig Tree Ministries, so I want people to check them out. They've got some great YouTube lectures, and they just add to the package and things that really enrich some of the context of some of these events that are captured in the Bible. And one of them, I've talked about it before, which is when Peter goes to stab the servant of the high priest when they are coming to arrest Jesus, right? He's about to be taken and put on trial by the religious authorities of that time, as he had predicted. And Peter, who had said, "Let it not be so, Lord, that you're going to die this death," he wants to have a political, Peter came from a region that was very heavy with zealot type figures that were really burning with passion and zeal for their people and their injustices that had happened to them. And they wanted to get a revolt, wanted to have justice mediated by a kind of warrior messiah. And they were still tempted by that same desire as anybody would be in the situation they're in. And in that spirit, it says that Peter, cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. Now, I've mentioned before, this guy's name is Malchus. And I've said before that, Jesus, is the high priest for Peter in this new movement of the way he's starting. And Peter's kind of like his right-hand man. And so is the servant of the high priest, Malchus, who he cuts the ear off. And I've pointed out that when he stabs, the ear, it's a typological or kind of like a symbolic way of saying, Jesus said, "Those who live by the sword die by the sword." You can't hear me. You can't receive my message of radical forgiveness, Peter, and look in the mirror. You're equal in this whole thing. You're mirror. I'm looking at the high priest as, Jesus looking at the mirror of the high priest who's going to kill him. Jesus wants to lay down his life. The high priest wants to take that man's life, Jesus. And in your mirror, Peter, looking at Malchus, you're over there stabbing his ear, right? And so you can't hear, because faith comes by hearing. Look in the mirror. Your guy, your mimetic double, your mirror double, Malchus, lost his ear. He can't hear. So he's not hearing the faith because you are using zealous violence, right? Well, Fig Tree Ministries points out, I wanted to add to that with some of the things that they said in one of their lectures, that, the sword that he uses is they call it like short sword or something. It's the same kind of sword that you would use to sacrifice a lamb, right? So just to add more to what I'm saying there, it just makes it even richer than, this is how Revelation in the Bible works. It's just so rich that the type of sword, I think it's called Sicarii or something. It's the type of sword, like a little short dagger that you would use to cut the throat of the lamb in your sacrifice. So Peter is using the same sacrificial zeal that he is steeped in that time and in the region in which he came from in Galilee, with the same spirit of, well, I'm gonna, and not only that, but it was a common thing where the zealots around that time, they would cut the ear or the nose or some part, a part of the body off of a priest who they thought was too much of a sellout for the Roman occupiers and the Hellenistic influence, which was their globalism of the day, in a micro scale. These things don't map one-to-one, but Rome is like the globalism of the day, and Hellenistic culture is the globalism, and all of it's kind of coming into this community and abusing them in different ways. And the zealots, the capital Z zealot movement that ultimately leads to the war where Rome comes in and destroys the temple in 70 AD, as Jesus predicted. The zealots would cut the ears off of wayward priests to show, look, you're going to have a living shame that you are, we've marked you as someone who is unworthy and shameful and should not be considered a legitimate priest because you're a sellout in various ways. You're not pure enough, right? You're not like our zealot purity. You're not legit, right? And so when Peter cuts this man's ear off, he's continuing that zealous spirit, using a sacrificial blade you would use to kill an animal as an offering for your anger and your grievance towards your brother. He's sacrificing, but he's cutting the ear off, so he's becoming like the zealots. And that a lot of the members of Jesus's disciples came from the zealot movement in various ways. They were influenced from that. And then some of them, like Matthew, are tax collectors who were to be the people that, they would be most likely to want to cut his ear off in another context. But Jesus is able to bring people who are in close proximity to the globalists of his time and occupiers and imperialists. And he's able to bring people who are on the other side, the more revolutionary figures. So I think that's an interesting layer just to add to that story in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Right, and that's very interesting, which means that in the Garden of Gethsemane there were two people who were close to the symbol of the dagger. One was also Judas Iscariot, right? And I mean, there's some debate about this, but the Iscariot title is like from a region like a man from Kerioth region, which was known to be associated with the Zealot, capital Z, Zealot movement, right? They were known as men of the dagger, and so we have like two uh, dagger men, and one was of course Peter, who cut off Malchus's ear with the dagger, and the other was Judas, who also betrayed, who in another sense like betrayed Christ with by handing him over to the authorities. And how Christ is going to deal with the two daggermen is very significant, right? Like one repented. Like this is basically a story of two zealots, right? One like that this story shows us how one, and I know I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, but I just wanted to put this in, is that uh Peter, after cutting off the ear, and he sees how his efforts have contributed to Christ being killed, is that he repents and he comes to accept Jesus's vision of the world, whereas the other Judas could not accept Jesus' vision of reconciliation, and therefore he killed himself, you know.
Right. Yeah, and the Peter's is he's not fully converted when he sees his hero Jesus healing the ear of this high priest, who, by the way, Malchus would be a high priest in training as well. So he would be a high priest, and Peter becomes a priest, right? In that sense. So that's interesting to note,
Right.
that Peter is becoming. So Malchus is on his way to participate in the sacrificial lynching of Jesus. And the irony of it is, of course, that Jesus is going to be the sacrificial lamb that all of their cultic religion that they think Jesus is endangering, he's actually going to fulfill it and complete it, so that it moves from the cultic ethnos as the supreme means of identity to the human person, right? And so Jesus is going to start that transition and complete it, and yet it's not yet complete. It's already, but not yet complete, as we see around us today. But Malchus is a high priest in training. He's a little priest as the right-hand man of the high priest, and Peter is a little priest in training, and he's using his little priestly short sword to, mirror the same spirit of sacrificial violence that Malchus is doing. He's mimetically enthralled in Malchus's worldview more than he is Jesus, right? And it's when he sees the ear healed, it's like, okay, he's getting it, but he's not yet, right? Because he still goes the opposite direction and stays with the spirit of the crowd by being silent and, ultimately betraying him 3 times, verbally saying, I don't have nothing to do with that guy. So he goes from, he's showing you that you can either, in your zeal for fighting for something, and in your zeal for running away from it, you're still caught up in the same matrix, which is might makes right, live by the sword, right? You know what I mean? And that's interesting to look at that Peter, whether he's running towards the violence with the zeal of sacrificially, maiming his opponent, as the zealots did in that time, or whether he's running away from Jesus now. So I don't know this dude, 3 times. He's still caught up in a spirit of sacrificial fervor. And it's only until that 3rd time that he finally gets it and starts to realize, he's been doing this the wrong way. When the rooster crows. So I wanted to also, some other things that Fig Tree's ministry put together that I thought was cool, just to kind of touch on some of these things. They have Cain and Abel are brothers. That's the first story in Genesis of brothers, and that ends up in murder. And then you have Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and they have rivalry and they have conflict, and that ends up in a curse and a type of slavery that Noah pronounces on them. Then you go to Isaac and Ishmael, which ends with a reunion, but the text says there's no embrace. So they show up for Abraham's death, so they're able to actually sit in the same room together, but there's no hug, there's no real reconciliation truly. Then you go to Jacob and Esau, and that rivalry ends in reunion plus embrace. So they're like, okay, we're going to hug, but we still need to have fences, okay? We're still going to put up a fence. You don't cross my spot, I don't cross your spot. You get to Joseph with his brothers. That's at the end of Genesis. And Joseph is a prefigurement of Jesus having suffered in the belly of the earth when he's thrown in by his brothers in jealousy, and when he's suffering in the belly of Egypt, in the dungeons, because he's falsely accused by a seductress with power and privilege. Either way, he's always suffering. He's like a suffering servant, but he gets vindicated in that Egyptian context, and he ultimately, he's offering forgiveness to his brothers at the end of that story. So you go in the Genesis story, you have almost a full, complete picture of where history is going to go, where the first brother, Cain and Abel, those doubles end in murder. Then you go to curse and slavery, bad, but not as bad as murder, but I guess it's depending on how you look at it. But then there's a softening reunion with no embrace. Then we get a reunion with embrace. And then ultimately with Joseph and brothers, we get forgiveness. And out of that last story, we go into Exodus, where they're a nation now, so that forgiveness is what allows them to be bound together to some degree at a level that produces a nation when they go into the Exodus story. So all of that to say, forgiveness can be it can be the glue that binds us together. And that's what Jesus is trying to, is always beckoning humans to really try to practice. Another point that I captured here from this podcast is Cain starts off the book of Genesis saying, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And then, Joseph basically answers that yes, because he forgives his brothers, even though he spares their life of Benjamin, right, the youngest. And he saves his life because of Judah. I believe it's Judah that steps up to try to protect Benjamin. And it's interesting that it's interesting when you think about that, of Joseph as a type of Jesus, right? And then you got, I'm just thinking this off the top of my head, but Paul of Tarsus, he comes from the tribe of Benjamin, I believe. So it's almost like, he's completing that journey of forgiveness. That's really cool. I like that. Let's write that down. I don't know if that's the thing, but I think that's a thing, where Paul of Tarsus is from the tribe of Benjamin. And so in that same position as Joseph forgives and spares the life of Benjamin, the youngest, because Judah was willing to go to, hey, look, take me, don't kill Benjamin. Benjamin's our dad's favorite. So obviously the brothers have gotten over their youthful arrogance of, being jealous. Now they're like, hey, look, dad loves him the most, just like he used to love you. I don't think he's seeing it that yet. He hasn't been disclosed as Joseph yet, I don't believe, but maybe he has. I don't know the context, but the point is that Joseph, offers forgiveness to his brothers because Judah was willing to offer, his life for Benjamin's. And then in the same sense, you have Jesus, who becomes the completion of the Lion of Judah as the slain lamb. And of course, Paul goes and spreads his message as the as a type of Benjamin, being given forgiveness. Now he goes and spreads that message of forgiveness to the whole world around him, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Paul did say that he is from the stock of Israel, from the tribe of Benjamin. And you have Paul from the tribe of Benjamin, and Jesus is from the tribe of Judah, and
Right.
he is also becoming a type of Joseph here, right? As Of course, I should say Joseph is a type of Christ. He is becoming Joseph here in the New Testament, and the reconciliation part and the forgiveness part here, which was there in the story of Joseph, is has been extended to the entire world,
Right.
right? It has been taken from the framework of the tribe, of the family, and it has been expanded universally.
Leviticus 19:18, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So when you let go of vengeance and you let go of bearing a grudge, you let go of the mimetic cycle that always seems to justify your ego, your insult, your irritation, your disrespect, your violence, and your call for violence in political life. So even back then, we have the picture that Jesus is going to complete. Obviously, those zealots that, had no place for Jesus's message, they knew Leviticus too, but for some reason, whatever, we're not judging people, right? We don't want to do the same spirit of zealousness, zealot spirit back on them. But they had that, but for some reason it hadn't fully, fully pictured to the point where they were able to get zealously behind Jesus's spirit of loving their enemies. They didn't want to do that. And they didn't want to go that full way because I guess in some ways, like you said, in some sense, you want to be the other, right? So if you're a zealot and you think that you have a right to violently overthrow Rome, it's because you're jealous that Rome has that power, You wish you had that power, and you wish you had that global empire that Rome sits on with their disgusting practices and, disgusting diets and disgusting behaviors and disgusting gods and all that and orgies. Why do they get to rule over and desecrate us and humiliate us? Well, we want to have that. We want to have their ability. Why don't they? We're jealous of the fact that they get to have, like you said, there's a zealous spirit for the law, but then there's an undercurrent of like, well, just like these radical jihadists that are willing to commit suicide terrorism, is it because they truly believe in the values they say they believe, or is it because they're nervous in their kind of encounter with the passions of the modern world? Why was it that suicide terrorists were going to Vegas before 9/11 and so forth, and so on? Why were they going to nightclubs like Pulse nightclub or the French nightclub shooting, where it's like, what is this fixation with the decadent degeneracy that they're supposed to be warring against, but yet there's kind of like you were saying earlier, well, to bring that point out, which is in fighting to enforce the boundaries, there's an envy for the transgressor of the boundary. And I think that was going on with the zealots, and with any kind of violent zealot spirit that we can all have, right?
Right. It's basically like it has the same resentment factor, which often we are often quick to ascribe to the left, but we can see this same resentment exists in people who tend to be ultra protective of the boundaries, right? As you have described, as like they are envious of the people who are like, how they have this mentality, why do you have the license to sin but I do not? It's
Right.
like that, right? So they have that kind of mentality towards people. That's like the Yeah, that's like the spiritual component of it. At the same time, they also have like a kind of attacking people because they're just different, you know. And So yeah, you're pretty accurate there.
Well, we have this word for forgiveness in the in the uh, in the Hebrew. It means afiemi, and it means to send away, leave alone, to let go, to release, right? To discharge. And in the Greek, the word for forgiveness means to lift, to carry, to take away. So think about forgiveness as the new alternative to sacrifice, right? Sacrificial violence against another, whether it's sacrificing your child to the gods that demand their heart, or it's sacrificing your life in the spirit of a battle to kill your enemy, or it's sacrificing your goat, your favorite goat, as a big chunk of your household's wealth and food and so forth to God. All these sacrificial discharges involve another. But then that's the scapegoat mechanism, and throughout different pictures in history, and it gets done away with when Christ fully completes the new sacrificial framework, which will be self-sacrifice, which will be anchored in forgiveness. Not suicide terrorism, which is laying down your life in a spirit of zeal to, defeat through force your opponent, but rather letting go of the force, letting go of the coercion, and not needing to discharge the bad blood, which is what we call catharsis, discharging the bad blood, the relief, taking away the bad blood, the anger. You can do it now with forgiveness. Each one of us are temples in which we, using our actions and our life and our word, can discharge sacrificial, violent zeal of our own volition. Think about how radically powerful that is. No longer do we need to go to the Capitol building through our representatives and have them vote for sending arms packages to sacrificially conquer some opponent. We don't have to go through that anymore. We don't have to do that in any sacrificial temple in the ancient world, and we don't have to do it in modern temples called politics, in which we have to discharge our anger, our fear, our aggression onto somebody else's back, whether it's sending soldiers or our treasure or whatever, or somebody else's people to die for some kind of crisis. Now because we no longer need a temple outside of us in a structural sense, whether it's a nation or a building or whatever, but rather as living bodies, as living temples, we can self-sacrifice our right to hold a grudge, our right to hold violent zeal, and discharge that energy ourselves. We have been given that power because of Jesus's inauguration of the personhood revolution in history. That's amazing. It's just a power that humans are oftentimes not courageous enough to practice. And I say that as myself, a human that has the same tendency. It is hard to do, but it is something you have to practice towards. That's why you've been given a life. And you're right, sir. We do enjoy our home. We enjoy, and it's okay to enjoy the home that you grew up in, the region, the food, the habits, the games. Those are things that you can enjoy. You're not meant to feel guilty for that. But I guarantee you, I believe something like the landmass of Florida will be in the new heavens and new creation. But I guarantee you that how many decades on Earth, if I live in Florida, say I'm lucky and I get to live into my 90s or hundreds or whatever, blessed, I guarantee you that's a small time compared to eternal living, right? Everlasting living in the new creation, new heavens, in which there'll probably be other planets to explore. I might have 1,000 or 10,000 years on another planet we don't even know of, and I might enjoy their cuisine or their culture or their something, and I might become more of an adopted person in some other, that's the point. We need to think big picture like that, right? And it doesn't mean, therefore, I can never live in Florida, the new heavens and new creation, or enjoy the oranges that were in Florida, or they were not native to Florida, but whatever was native to Florida, whatever it is that you think is uniquely Florida, the beaches of the Gulf, right? You might still be able to enjoy that Gulf beach, but you also might be able to enjoy a beach in a galaxy far, far away. so you never know what when you have eternity to live, there's no no ability to capture what exactly you might be able to become a fan of, right, culturally or whatever. So that gives us excitement to think about in the future.
Right. We often forget that heaven and earth. What makes the kingdom of God is that it's not just heaven, but it's also earth, right? And the two get merged together, I believe. This is why it's like it takes the form of a city in the book of Revelations. It's something that we human beings can comprehend, because if it was otherworldly, we wouldn't even know what it is. So strangeness would be alien to us, right? That if we are like, say, we are living in a place something very different from Earth, at the end of the world, then we would be very far removed from it. But what makes it better is that it is going to be part of our home. It is going to resemble our home, and this is where the brother aspect comes in, right? Is that uh you know we're not the same as the other person. We're always uniquely different, and that what makes the kingdom so better is that we're not the same, we're different. And that's like looking that's like transcendent the transcending the hostilities and all of that we have in the current age. But Jesus actually redeems the word brother from its ancient connotation of sibling rivalry and sacrificial killing of the one part of the twins. So Jesus redeems that, and he makes it uh non-violent, so to speak. He makes it prosperous, and he makes it completely deified.
Yeah. And I think I like the idea of thinking about live each day as if you're going to live forever. Because if we are going to live forever, whatever that means, we're going to have a long time to live with the consequences and the choices that we make. So we might as well make the right choices, and we might as well, love the things that we know, but don't idolize them. Don't cling to them as if they are, essential to your being. It's like a balance. You don't want to throw them away in some kind of fake zealous spirit of undifferentiated. That's silly. But you also don't want to cling too hard to them to the point where it becomes an ego thing, wherein you can, treat, your local tribe, in a way that is disrespectful and dishonorable to somebody else. And another way to look at it is to say, growing up in Florida, I might like my grandmother's apple pie better than, somebody likes their grandmother's, red bean paste cake in Japan from their grandmother. But in Andromeda, we haven't had the apple pie there yet. Have you tried the apple pie in Andromeda yet? And that's the point. That's what a Christian thinks like, right? It's like the frontier spirit. And that spirit isn't just about the galaxies like I'm referencing. It's this idea that you enjoy and love that which you have next to you and that God's given you, but you don't idolize it and use it as a means by which to look down upon another in any way, shape, or form, because you have no idea where the future lies. Because that's the whole point, right? That spirit that animates us forward. We haven't tried the apple pie in Andromeda yet, so we just don't know.
Yeah, that's where the letting go part of forgiveness comes in. I think is that you let uh you let your home be your home, and it's not like you are clinging to your home and you're not just letting go of it, or you're clinging to the other tribe and you're not just letting go of it. And that's like, I'm glad you brought up the root meaning of that word, which is used for forgiveness. The Hebrew word is that it's also like you're not supposed to coercively impose your forgiveness on other people, right? It's supposed to be completely voluntary, right? You're supposed to persuade another person to, being forgiven or to forgive you, but you're not supposed to, have a hatred for your own kind and impose forgiveness and, just bow down to other people in act of idolatry, as you put it, right? And you're not supposed to hate other people's tribes, uh, in a similar fashion.
Yeah. And I just like that word discharge that the text says for the word forgiveness. This sending away, this discharging is on a physics level a real phenomenon that we'll get into. We've done in the past. I've done shows in the science and use segment, but there's a real physics phenomenon behind this discharging of the energy that's built up, the tension, the high energy environment of a zealous community racked with zealous violent aggression. It is so in this sense, forgiveness is a social technology. Forgiveness is a means of discharging bad blood and high energy, hateful energy out of a community in a safe way, without having to kill somebody or war against somebody or send somebody else's son off or daughter off to go fight and be sacrificially killed. You don't have to discharge because we have the technology of forgiveness. So let's use it and let's implement it every day. Appreciate your time, Surit.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And email us hello@aneighborschoice.com to give us any feedback. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.